Imagine staring at a completely pitch black screen. The only thing you can see are 15 little glowing dots just kind of floating in the dark.
Right, like no context at all.
Exactly. You can't see a face, you can't see any clothing, physical size, or even the environment they're in. But as those dots begin to move, bouncing in this rhythmic pattern, an observer specifically, like a violent offender, can tell instantly if you are an easy target.
Which is just wild to think about.
It really is. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, our mission is to unpack the fascinating and honestly mostly invisible psychology of how criminals evaluate threats before a conflict even begins.
Yeah, before a single word is even spoken.
Right. And we are relying on a single, incredibly focused source for this. It's a scientific review article from Valortech by an expert named Herfel. It's titled Psychology of Criminal Engagement. And it basically takes this hard empirical look at how offenders perceive three very different targets in their environment. So a uniformed police officer, a uniformed security guard, and a plainclothes civilian.
Yeah, and the underlying premise of this research, it completely upends how society generally thinks about street crime.
Oh, totally.
Because, people tend to focus so heavily on the physical altercation itself. Like the exact moment a weapon is drawn or a punch is thrown. But Herfel's review forces us to look backward along the timeline.
To what happens before all that.
Exactly. We're exploring the split-second, silent calculations happening in a criminal's mind before any physical move is made. And by looking at those three distinct categories of targets, we get to see how the brain processes risk, authority, and vulnerability under extreme pressure.
Which means by the end of this deep dive, you will walk away looking at the people on the street and honestly your own body language completely differently.
No, without a doubt.
Because you are always broadcasting signals, whether you realize it or not. But to really grasp how those signals are received, we have to understand the foundational operating system of a criminal's mind. I mean, there is this pervasive myth of the completely random attack, right? The idea that violence is just a roll of the dice.
Right, the whole wrong place at the wrong time idea.
Yeah, exactly. But our source points us to routine activity theory to kind of dispel that. The theory argues that a crime only occurs when you have converging elements. So a motivated offender, a suitable target, and the absence of a capable guardian.
Yeah, but it's not just a simple math equation, is it?
No, it's more like overlapping Venn diagrams of risk and opportunity happening in real time.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the criminal is essentially running a continuous rapid-fire environmental scan. Like, they're constantly processing the lighting, the escape routes, the presence of witnesses, surveillance cameras, and the apparent ability of anyone nearby to detect them, resist them, or intervene.
So they're taking in a ton of data all at once.
Exactly. So the absence of a capable guardian doesn't just mean there isn't a police officer physically standing right there. It means the offender has evaluated the specific space and determined that no one present possesses the capability and the willingness to stop them. They are calculating overlapping probabilities of success versus capture.
Wow. That fundamentally changes how I view the justice system. I mean, we spend so much time debating prison sentences and long-term consequences. But if a criminal is actively running this microscan of their immediate environment, what actually stops them from acting?
That's the core question.
Because the severity of a future punishment like, getting 20 years in a penitentiary, that feels way too abstract to matter in a 5-second window on a dark street.
And the data on deterrence theory heavily supports that conclusion. The most enduring finding in criminology is that the severity of a remote future punishment does very little to deter an offender in the heat of the moment.
Really? Almost nothing.
Pretty much. Because the human brain, especially one operating under the stress of committing a crime, heavily discounts future consequences. What actually alters their behavior is the certainty of immediate apprehension.
I've always thought about that dynamic like touching a hot stove.
Okay, I like that.
Yeah, so if I reach out to touch a glowing red burner, the immediate pain of the burn, the absolute certainty that my flesh is going to blister right this second, that stops my hand instantly.
Right, it's an immediate reflex.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That immediate physical consequence overrides any other thought. It works 1,000,000 times faster than a doctor sitting me down and warning me about the long-term severity of nerve damage I might suffer, like months from now. The street encounters of the hot stove. The certainty of capture has to be immediate and obvious.
The immediate burn of the hot stove is the perfect way to visualize the certainty of capture. That makes visibility, authority, and immediate intervention capacity the most psychologically decisive factors on the street.
Makes sense.
But Herfel's review does add a crucial caveat here, though. We cannot treat offenders as perfectly rational, cold-blooded calculators.
Right. They aren't robots.
Exactly. They are not supercomputers running sterile algorithms. They're often operating under immense emotional strain, extreme time pressure, tunnel vision, or the heavy effects of narcotics. So their cognition is heavily degraded.
Okay, but wait. Wait, so you're telling me that creates a massive contradiction. If the certainty of capture is the ultimate deterrent, how is a guy high on adrenaline or drugs accurately calculating my ability to capture or resist him?
It's a great question.
Because he's not doing complex probability math in his head. If his cognition is degraded, what is he actually looking at to make this rapid-fire decision?
So they fall back on primal, deeply ingrained heuristics, specifically regarding human movement. And the source highlights those point light movement displays we mentioned earlier to prove this.
The dots in the dark room.
Exactly. Researchers took people, placed them in completely dark rooms, and attached glowing dots to their major joints. Shoulders, elbows, hips, knees, ankles. And then they just had them walk across a room.
I'm picturing those motion capture suits actors wear in video game development. Just a dark room and a bunch of glowing ping pong balls mapping out the geometry of a person's joints.
The setup is identical. All an observer sees is the geometric motion of those isolated dots. There are no facial expressions to read, no physical size to gauge, no clothing to evaluate.
Nothing but movement.
Nothing but movement. And the studies found that observers, particularly those with a history of violence, could reliably distinguish easy targets from hard targets entirely based on that isolated gait and body movement.
Wait, really? So an offender doesn't even need to see my face to know if I'm a soft target?
Not at all.
They are reading the mechanics of my stride, like they are looking at whether I drag my feet, whether my stride is short or asymmetrical, or if my weight transfer looks unbalanced.
What's fascinating here is that criminals are reading your baseline vulnerability before they even process other tactical information. They are evaluating your posture, your pace, and your physical synchrony.
That is wild.
And the research delves into inmate populations and found that offenders who score exceptionally high in psychopathic traits explicitly and consciously rely on gait to read vulnerability.
You mean they know they're doing it?
Yes. They were shown videos of people walking and could accurately pick out individuals who had previously been victims of assault simply by watching how their joints moved. They have this honed, almost predatory ability to spot subtle mechanical signs of weakness.
That is deeply unsettling. It's like watching a nature documentary where the predator spots the one gazelle in the herd that has a slight limp.
Right, exactly.
Because the predator isn't evaluating the whole herd's horns, right? It's just looking for the easiest mechanical takedown.
The biological parallel is remarkably accurate, and this initial assessment translates directly into the physical mechanics of the actual crime. Robbery research shows that an offender's level of violence at the very start of an encounter is modulated by the resistance they anticipate from you, based entirely on those initial movement cues. Wow. Yeah, if they read you as weak, they might use less initial force, expecting easy compliance. But if they read you as capable but still decide to attack, then they will launch with overwhelming initial violence to preempt your resistance.
Just overwhelm you immediately.
Right. But the violence during the event is shaped by the resistance they actually observe once the conflict begins. So they are constantly adjusting their aggression based on whether they can dominate the physical space.
So if offenders are absolute masters at reading these subtle physical cues of vulnerability in fractions of a second, how does their brain process the loudest, most obvious cue possible? Like when we introduce a uniformed law enforcement officer into that environment, we are entirely changing the visual landscape.
We really are. The police uniform is categorized as the highest pre-contact deterrent for a very specific psychological reason.
Okay.
The review emphasizes that the uniform acts as a compressed signal.
A compressed signal, what does that mean?
Well, when an offender looks at a patrol officer, they aren't just seeing a human being who happens to have a firearm on their hip. The fabric, the badge, the radio, they compress a massive amount of complex institutional data into one rapid visual heuristic.
Ah, I get it. It's a cognitive shortcut. The offender's brain doesn't have to evaluate the officer's gait or posture because the uniform screams state authority, lawful force, the power of arrest, and immediate radioed backup. It is the absolute embodiment of the hot stove we talked about earlier.
And the data from Hotspot's policing research consistently validates that compressed signal. Simply putting visible, uniformed police in a specific high-crime area significantly reduces the occurrence of crime.
Just them being there.
Just being there. It immediately alters the offender's internal estimate of immediate risk. They know their baseline probability of being interrupted, identified, and captured has skyrocketed.
It's that immediate certainty again.
Right. There was even a perception study detailed in the review where criminal offenders were asked to rate officers. They rated the exact same police officers significantly higher in confidence, respect, and authority when those officers were in their everyday patrol uniforms compared to when they were in civilian clothes.
So the fabric itself communicates orderly consequence. The uniform does the heavy lifting, so the officer doesn't have to physically demonstrate their capability.
Yes. But here's where it gets really interesting, though.
Okay, I'm ready.
The natural assumption is that if an everyday patrol uniform is a strong deterrent, then outfitting an officer in heavy tactical gear like overt riot armor or militarized equipment would multiply that deterrence.
Right, because a higher threat posture should equal a greater fear of capture.
Right, but the source points out a crucial nuance where that escalation actually backfires.
Really? It makes it worse.
Yes, the sociological concept of legitimacy comes heavily into play here. Overt, highly militarized gear can severely reduce the perceived legitimacy of the officer in the eyes of the public and the offender.
I can see how that shifts the dynamic. Because if a standard uniform signals orderly consequence and the rule of law, strapping on militarized gear changes the psychological signal completely.
Exactly.
It stops saying, I am here to enforce the law, and starts saying, I am here to conquer this space.
Exactly. And instead of calming a situation through the promise of orderly consequence, a high-threat posture triggers a different psychological mechanism in the offender reactive hostility.
Huh.
The offender's brain stops seeing a representative of the law and starts seeing a rival combatant. This can provoke a fight-or-flight ego defense, sparking physical violence, because the visual signal has shifted from law enforcement to domination.
That makes total sense. Looking too ready for a fight creates the exact environmental tension that causes the fight.
Precisely.
So if the state authority of a police uniform is the ultimate deterrent, what happens when we strip away the state part but keep the uniform? That lands us squarely in the world of private security guards.
Yeah. And the security guard occupies a highly volatile middle ground in the threat assessment landscape. The research categorizes them as a conditional deterrent.
Conditional.
Yeah. Unlike a police officer, where state authority is universally assumed, the security guard's deterrence relies entirely on the offender's real-time evaluation of their credibility.
Which means just wearing a polo shirt with a patch on the shoulder isn't enough to stop someone who is actively looking for an opportunity.
Not at all. The offender evaluates 3 distinct metrics when they spot a security guard. So, the guard's willingness to supervise the area, their physical ability to detect a crime in progress, and their actual willingness to intervene.
Right.
If the guard passes that evaluation, they can be highly effective. The review cites a transit system trial demonstrating that uniformed, unarmed guards significantly reduced victim-generated crimes simply by being active, present guardians.
That makes sense for an active guardian, but the term conditional deterrent makes me think of a scarecrow in a farmer's field.
Oh, a scarecrow. How so?
Well, when the farmer first drives the post into the ground and dresses the scarecrow, it works perfectly. The birds fly over, see the silhouette, assume it's a threat, and stay away from the crops.
Okay, yeah.
But the deterrence is entirely conditional on the birds believing the scarecrow is capable of intervention.
Oh.
Once the birds watch the scarecrow for a few days and realize it never actually moves, it just stands there while the wind blows, the illusion breaks.
All right.
Eventually, you have birds sitting right on the scarecrow's hat, eating the crops. A purely observe and report, unarmed guard who never intervenes seems like they would rapidly become a scarecrow.
The scarecrow analogy works perfectly, but the reality on the street involves a much more dangerous twist. Because birds just ignore a broken scarecrow, criminals will actively exploit a break in guard.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Once an offender tests the boundaries and realizes the guard is strictly observing and will not physically intervene, the guard actually becomes a shield for the criminal.
Wait, a shield?
Yeah, because onlookers assume the uniformed guard has the situation under control, which suppresses the bystander effect. The public doesn't call the police because they assume the guard is handling it, while the criminal operates freely right in front of them.
That is a terrifying exploitation of human psychology.
It really is.
And it really highlights the massive gulf between an unarmed guard and an armed guard. The introduction of a firearm has to fundamentally alter the offender's cognitive math. The source mentions the weapons effect regarding armed guards. How does a visible gun change the cognitive landscape of that encounter?
Well, the psychological literature surrounding the weapon's effect reveals that the mere visual presence of a firearm alters human cognition, specifically through a phenomenon called weapon focus.
Weapon focus.
Right. When an offender sees a holstered weapon on a guard, their brain allocates an enormous amount of visual and cognitive bandwidth entirely to that gun. It instantly makes the encounter feel vastly more serious and raises the perceived cost of escalation.
Because the hot stove just became lethal. The offender isn't just calculating the risk of being detained and reported, the weapon focus hijacks their brain and forces them to calculate the immediate risk of lethal counterforce.
Exactly. And this raises an important question for the private security industry regarding training and liability. A visible firearm raises the stakes,
Mhm.
but it doesn't guarantee deterrence if the human wearing it lacks credibility.
Hmm.
If an armed guard is looking down at their phone slouching or appears physically unready, offenders process that discrepancy instantly.
They see through it.
They do. They read it as false confidence.
Yeah.
They see the lethal tool, but they evaluate the operator as incapable of making a high-stress decision.
Wow.
So security companies cannot rely on bare minimum checkbox training because an inattentive guard in an armed uniform isn't a capable guardian. They're just a high-value target carrying a weapon they don't know how to retain.
A placeholder with a gun is infinitely more dangerous to the public than an empty room.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've analyzed the compressed signal and state authority of the police officer. We've explored the conditional credibility and weapon focus surrounding the security guard. That leaves us with the final category, which strips away all visible symbols of authority entirely. This brings us directly to you, the listener, the plainclothes civilian. How does the criminal calculation shift when there is absolutely no uniform to read?
The civilian represents the absolute lowest visible deterrent at the initial target selection stage. Because there are no institutional consequences to evaluate, no badge, no radio, no state authority, the offender's brain falls back entirely on those raw vulnerability cues we discussed with the point light displays.
Okay, let's unpack this, because this is where the theory hits the pavement for you listening right now. When the offender is looking at a civilian, they are purely evaluating the geometry of a soft target.
Yes.
They are looking for sensory deprivation. Are you isolated from the herd? Are your eyes locked on a glowing screen? Do you have bad posture that implies emotional fragility or physical weakness?
It's all about what you project.
Yeah, I picture a predator in nature looking at an animal grazing. The animal with its head buried in the grass, unaware of the wind shifting, is the one that gets selected. The offender isn't asking if you have the authority to arrest them. They're asking, can I take total physical control of this person quickly, quietly, and without taking damage?
Which brings us to the paradox of hidden capability.
Oh, what's that?
A plainclothes civilian might possess extraordinary defensive capabilities. You might be a highly trained martial artist, or possess incredible situational awareness, or legally carry a concealed weapon. But because none of those attributes are visibly compressed into a recognizable symbol like a police uniform, they do absolutely nothing to deter the offender's initial target selection.
So the offender doesn't know you have pepper spray in your pocket or a black belt in jiu-jitsu until they've already made the decision to attack you.
Exactly.
Your hidden capabilities don't prevent the ambush. They only help you survive it once the violence has already started.
Right. The civilian's advantage in these scenarios is not deterrence. The advantage is entirely reliant on the offender making a fatal miscalculation about your capability. But relying on an offender to miscalculate is an incredibly dangerous survival strategy. You do not want the encounter to progress to the physical testing phase.
Which means your absolute best defense against street crime isn't the physical tool you carry, it's the physical geometry you project.
100%.
Keeping your head up, staying completely off your phone while in transitional spaces, making brief, purposeful eye contact to signal that you see them, and walking with an asymmetrical, balanced stride. All of that projects the geometry of a hard target.
You are artificially raising your perceived ability to resist.
Right. You have to win the psychological evaluation in the criminal's mind before the physical fight even becomes an option.
And that encapsulates the core reality of criminal engagement laid out in Herfel's review. It is a continuous, high-stress process of fast threat appraisal under profound uncertainty. Criminals do not wander the streets picking victims at random. They are ruthlessly selecting probabilities. They're evaluating the likelihood of resistance, the timing of the encounter, the presence of witnesses, and their own immediate survivability.
Every time you step out of your door, you are walking into that murky diagnostic landscape. You are broadcasting an X-ray of your situational awareness to anyone who is looking for an opportunity.
That's a great way to put it.
The civilian who projects the capability of a guardian is processed by the criminal brain entirely differently from the civilian who projects sensory deprivation and physical disconnection.
And exploring how deeply offenders rely on these baseline human cues, our gait, our distraction, our isolation, it reveals a very concerning vulnerability in our modern environment.
Whoa.
Well, if criminals are already this adept at exploiting sensory deprivation, it forces us to reconsider how our physical behavior is evolving.
Oh man, think about the rapidly increasing adoption of augmented reality glasses or like spatial computing headsets in public spaces.
Yes.
We are already seeing people walking down crowded city streets, pinching and swiping at invisible digital screens floating in front of their eyes. They are completely immersed in a digital ecosystem while their physical bodies are just navigating the concrete sidewalk on autopilot.
It represents the ultimate self-inflicted display of sensory deprivation.
It really does. If violent offenders select their targets based on probabilities of detection and the geometry of distraction, how will this technology alter the threat landscape? As we strap spatial computers to our faces and voluntarily block out our physical environments, are we collectively lowering our human readability of risk?
It's a huge concern.
We might be hanging giant, invisible neon signs over our heads that broadcast absolute vulnerability to anyone operating in the real world. Let that chew on your mind the next time you step out your front door. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Stay aware out there.